Hello and welcome to our Produmex WMS container management video. This video will introduce Produmex's container tracking system. Containers are used to keep track of material that is inbound into your warehouse or outbound going out of your warehouse to perhaps a customer. So for example, if you're purchasing goods overseas, you can use containers to track the material as it is being shipped from the vendor, perhaps going through an inland freight stage, and then arrives at the foreign port. It is then transferred onto an ocean-going vessel, and that vessel transits for typically a couple of weeks, and then it lands at the domestic port, and then the container management system will help you keep track of its transition into the inland freight mode so that it can then arrive at your warehouse. So to make all this work, we have to do a bit of setup in the Produmex system. First thing we indicate is, do we want to include reserve invoices in our container system, or do we only want to expose purchase orders to the container tracking? If you take ownership of the material when it leaves the vendor's dock, then it's very likely you're going to have to use reserve invoices so that you can keep track of the ownership of the material. Do you want to automatically close containers? In some cases, you will set this to yes when you want a material handler in the warehouse, for example, to, upon completing the reception of a container, have it automatically close the container. In other cases, you may want to leave that container open and have perhaps an administrator or a manager in the office go through on an SAP screen and manually close the container. Your next step for your global configuration will be to set threshold values for your volume, weight, and financial amounts so that you can best track the material that is being put into the container. So once you've set these thresholds, you're saying, I'm not going to allow, or I want to have a visual indication of any material that's over a certain amount going into, that's over a certain percentage of the allowed value going into the cube or the weight of our container. To make this work, we then have to set our weight and cube values on our item master data. This applies to all item master data that will be used in the containers. And typically this is updated on our item master data screen. However, it can also be updated using SAP's DTW function so that we could do a bulk import on those values. When we have completed our basic configuration, we'll also want to configure our ports, our container shipping status values, and our shipping types. So, brief introduction, our ports are going to let us indicate each of the from or to ports that occur in your supply chain. In this case, we have some examples here of ports in China and ports in the US. Notice also that these ports could be not only ocean-going ports, but also airports. The ports include normal lead time and express lead time. So in this case, it normally takes 3 days to process material in the Shanghai port, and it typically takes 2 days to process material in Newark Airport. However, if we choose to request expedited processing, then our lead time is indicated under Express. Next, we look at the container shipping status values. These are user defined so that you could keep track of each individual stage or step that the material goes through this entire import or export process. So in this case, you might choose to remove certain of these status values like wash or perhaps returned, or you might add other stages or steps to reflect the various other modes of transportation, such as inland freight going to the foreign port, inland freight going from the domestic port to our dock. Finally, you'll set up your SAP Business One shipping types. These shipping types will operate just like normal SAP shipping types, but we also add certain other attributes to them to expedite the workflow within Produmex WMS. So in this case, we're doing automatic shipping, and we're indicating that the customer is calling to collect the goods for our will call. However, the other modes don't have those attributes. Now that we've got our configuration in place and we have our ports and shipping statuses and shipping types set up, next thing we have to do is set up a population of purchase orders or reserve invoices. In our example here, we're going to go ahead and use purchase orders, but the exact same thing applies if we're using reserve invoices. Likewise, this example that we're showing in this video is all about the inbound process as just an example. But the same approach applies on the outbound side with your customer sales orders and your deliveries and your AR reserve invoices for that matter. And finally, we introduce the container. Everything we've done so far is leading up to putting together our container. And we'll talk through this in good detail when we get into the presentation. But one key thing we want to bear in mind is that that container, once we are able to start receiving it, once the container actually is on our dock, we go into the container with our handheld, select on the handheld the container receiving function, and we can receive the entire container in one operation, or we could do multiple receipts off that container. And again, that container will close if you've got your system configured to do so. Otherwise, that function can be done separately. We'll start our presentation on Produmex WMS container management by launching the organizational structure and looking at the core configuration of the system. To do this, we're going to first select the company and then select extension parameters. From there, we'll select the container management controller. The container management controller gives us the core choices we talked about in the introduction. Do we want to enable reserve invoices to be available on the containers, or do we only want to look at purchase orders? In our demo system here, we're only looking at purchase orders, but this clearly enables the function. Do we want to automatically close the container when the material in the container is either received or delivered? In our environment, we've chosen yes to that, so that when they're offloading a container at our dock, after they've completed receipt of the last units on the container, it will automatically close. Other operations might choose to turn this option off and make sure that instead the containers are closed by the warehouse manager or the operations manager, somebody in the office who might want to put a review on that container. The rest of these values represent the thresholds. These are tolerances that indicate how close we are in terms of volume, weight, or dollar amount to the capacity of our container. So we'll see how this works in a few minutes, but at a high level, if we have configured our container to have more cube in it than is allowed by the size of the indicated cube of the container, then the size will be rendered in red. If the values, on the other hand, are too low, if we're underutilizing the container, they will render in yellow. So here you have the various different percentage values that make up that tolerance. Next, we'll bring up the definitions of our ports. So in our ports, we've gone ahead and indicated the various from and to ports, source and destination ports that exist within our company's supply chain. In this example, we've created a few ports in China and a few ports in the United States. Obviously, there would be many more ports than this, the more complex our supply chain gets. We've also indicated certain ports as airports because we do a certain amount of air freight. Normal lead time and the express lead time are the number of days it takes for material to be processed by the port. So between the time when the vessel or aircraft arrives and the time when that material can actually start its transit, its next step of its transit cycle. The container shipping status values are user defined and allow each installation to have their own stages through which the container will go. So for example, you could add other types of shipping statuses like um, um, in inbound freight mode, where the material is being shipped from the freight from the port into the actual facility. And so you would actually be able to keep track of that container's exact situation based on these status values. And what's nice about this is if you're managing, 10 or 20 or 50 containers, each one of them has its own status value. So you can then use this as a tool to help you plan your dock space and your arrival schedule for your inbound containers. Notice also that the sequence is user defined. So in this example, the shipping status of scheduled appears at the top of the list, followed by the shipping status of shipped. And that again, user defined so that you would control how you want this to appear. And finally, the shipping types. These are standard SAP shipping types with several characteristics added to provide additional functionality throughout the WMS. In our example here for container management, we've gone ahead and added a couple of freight carriers who are typically going to be shipping vessels. We can also use UPS for our air freight. And notice we've set up will call so that it automatically handles the shipping. It automatically handles invoicing. So when a customer drives up with their own vehicle, we can go ahead and completely process their order into an invoice when the shipping type is will call. Once your core configuration is in place, you'll want to review your item master data and make sure that all of your items have appropriate dimensions and weight values set up. In this example, we look at the purchasing tab for this item master data record, and we can find the dimensions, the cube, and the weight for this item set up on the standard SAP fields. Be sure also to set up the same factors on your sales tab if you're going to use container management for outbound containers, with outbound containers. This is optional and will be typically used when you're trying to judge the contents that you're putting in the container against that container's capacity. With our system configured, With our items now having their weights, dimensions, and cube values set up, we're ready to go ahead and start putting our purchase orders on containers. So in the Produmex WMS, we're going to go to the purchasing module and then to container management. The container management screen appears, and you'll notice that there's several types of information that are being collected in its several sections. First, we'll describe the container. And so in this case, we will put in our container code. Now, this could have been supplied for you by the owner of the container, but in this case, we'll just use a date that a code that reflects the date, the container type, and the date. This is going to be a standard LD7 container, typically used on air freight. However, this could also be a 40-foot container or any other container you choose to manage. It's estimated that the transit of this material will take 3 days en route. And notice that if this were to depart on the 24th, that it would then arrive on the 30th after compounding the en route time and the other lead times which are compounded through the system. We're going to skip the business partner, which would give us additional filtering on the different purchase orders we might want to appear on the document. We have the option to put in our bill of lading number and our expedition number. These are user defined, as well as reference to proof of delivery. We will put in our maximum volume, which in this case is 364 cubic feet. Likewise, our container will be set up with a capacity of 10,200 pounds. And we'll go ahead and leave our actual dates at this point blank. We'll set our shipping container status to scheduled. Note that the scheduled value is the first one to appear as driven from your sequencing of numbers. The shipping type, we'll say this is going to go UPS, which is our air freight. Our port of origin, which we'll go ahead and put in Shanghai International. And our destination will be Newark International. Next, we'll go ahead and add our lines onto the purchase order. Now, in this case, we've got several purchase orders that are open. These are purchase orders whose lines are not entirely on other containers and are still open. So in this case, we'll select 2 purchase orders. It brings back all of the lines on both purchase orders. Now it's up to us to edit this so that we actually reflect what's on the container. Now, to step back from that, there's a couple of ways that people will manage their containers. Either one, they will be taking the commercial invoice or the bill of lading provided by, say, the freight forwarder and simply entering the purchase order lines that are on those documents without concern for any planning or evaluation, because this is, in that case, it's a reflection of what's actually on the container. Another scenario is that the container management screen is being used for planning the container. And this might be done by a freight forwarder or an agent who has access to the Produmex WMS environment. So as you can see, there's several options here. Now we're going to go ahead and remove a few lines from our container because clearly, as we can see here in red, we are over capacity. Now this is an interesting situation typical of air freight. We're weight constrained long before we're volume constrained. So the system's telling us we're fine on volume, but we're still over on weight. So let's go ahead and remove a few more lines here. And as we're planning out the container, now it's actually changed the color to yellow, meaning that this is significantly under capacity. That is to say, we set our tolerances such that if this were a concern, it would appear in yellow, the under capacity utilization. But in this case, we're weight constrained, so there really is no option here. And now in our simple example, we are now able to utilize that container because we're now within capacity. Now, clearly we could put additional products in. We could have adjusted the quantities to get a better utilization of that space. But for our purposes now, this will serve as a good example. So at this point, we're going to go and add that container. And the system now understands that contents from purchase order 1262 and 1272 are both being transited on that container. And our next step will be to update this container as the transit occurs, and finally to then receive it in our warehouse as a container. Once our container is set up, we maintain it, we continue to update it based on its progress during its shipment. So for example, it might be appropriate now to change its status to shipped once we get confirmation from our agent or freight forwarder that the container is actually shipped. And we may want to change the container status then to in transit. We'll update those. And then time passes, and perhaps it's now time to receive this container. So now we go over to the WMS handheld. We're looking at our emulator on the left, but this is exactly the presentation you'll see on the handheld device. We're using a portable handheld, and this is a typical example of the view. We're going to go into purchasing, and from there, reception. We're going to indicate the dock where our container will be unloaded. And then instead of coming down here to our purchase order as we've done before, we're going to come down here to container. The system recognizes our container, container number 2, with its description and its container code. We'll go ahead and click to accept that. We'll satisfy various information that's required in our system, such as various metrics, as you can see here. And now we'll go to our receiving task. This follows the standard receiving that's done for purchase orders. The main difference here is it's done for all the purchase order lines that are on the container. Other than that, the process is essentially similar to standard WMS purchase order receiving. So are all the logistics units identical? No, they're not in our case. We don't have any labels on the logistics units. And so now we select a product to be received. We'll receive the rainbow printer, and we're expecting a quantity. We'll skip the reason, and we'll enter a quantity of 20 units for our rainbow printer. Are there other products on the pallet that haven't yet been scanned? Yes, there are. We'll select another product to be received. No reason for this. And then we'll go ahead and we'll put in our quantity of 75 rainbow printers. Now this is a little bit interesting. If you go back to our container, you'll notice there is no quantity 75. However, the rainbow printer appears on 2 different purchase orders, and it's being received in a consolidated manner. Now, obviously, you can use standard WMS handheld scanning techniques to receive this larger quantity onto different pallets or different logistics units or in different put away processes. And our final product, the motherboard. And in this case, we're doing a full and complete receipt. And we'll print our labels. The system generates the label, and in our case, we're doing it to a PDF file. Let's open that PDF while our receiving is underway. And here's our receipt label with our SSCC at the bottom, as well as our reception date and our other information. As with all Produmex printouts, this is done in Crystal Reports, meaning that you can modify that to those labels to suit your particular requirements. Coming back to SAP, if we now refresh the container, we'll see that that container is now fully processed. And if we now were to go to our purchase order, we would now see that we have a receipt of the items from the container that were on that that came from that purchase order. So if we right click, go into our relationship map, we'll see a goods receipt PO for the goods in question. Not for the full PO, because that full PO was not on the container, only these items. So that provides an introduction to Produmex WMS container management. Thank you for your time.